Hi, I'm Lou Warner, a student intern at WGLT. During this election season, WGLT's Democracy's Future podcast explores what Illinois' youngest voters think about where we're headed, and what issues they care about the most. Listen to the Democracy's Future podcast from WGLT, part of the NPR network.
Previously on WGLT's 12,000 Bombs. At age 15, astrophysicist Fred Lamb went to the library for 3 days after school to figure out if it made sense for his family to build a bomb shelter. It didn't. When he joined the faculty at the University of Illinois, Lamb's colleagues were among the team of scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, developing the world's first atomic bombs. Bombs that were fired by the United States on Japan near the end of World War II. Lamb has spent his life trying to convince people that such a bomb should never be used again. According to Lamb, the threat of nuclear war is as high as it's been since the Cold War. The good news is there are far fewer nuclear weapons on Earth than there were then. It's about 12,000 bombs. I'm Lauren Warnicki. On today's episode, we talk to 3 young physicists to hear what they think. And like Lamb, the next generation of astrophysicists knows the only winning move in nuclear war is not to play.
My name is Claire Campbell, and I am a second-year undergraduate computational physics student at Illinois State University. I do some research with Dr. Matt Kaplan.
Claire is from Towanda, Illinois, a town of 430 people just northeast of Illinois State in Normal.
My name is Andy Santorelli, and I'm a graduate student at Illinois State University.
Andy is from Springfield, Illinois. He originally studied audio engineering and has lived a few other places before returning to Central Illinois to study physics.
And I study exotic stars and their structure and how they evolve throughout their lifetimes.
My name is Naomi Sato. I just recently graduated from ISU in physics education. I also did art and women and gender studies, so that's kind of the interdisciplinary background I have, and I'm currently looking for grad school coming up next. I also did work with Dr. Kaplan, as all 3 of us did, and I'm originally from the suburbs of Chicago.
The aforementioned Dr. Matt Kaplan is a physics professor at ISU and my partner on this podcast. He organized a companion speaker series on campus, which Claire, Andy, and Naomi have attended for the last several weeks. This is a bye week before the final session, so I wanted to get their impressions on what they've heard and how they're processing the science, policy, and politics of nuclear weapons leading up to the 2024 election. Here's Claire Campbell.
I did not always intend to major in physics. I was very interested in astronomy, and in high school, I was not such a fan of physics. But as I've taken more physics classes, learned more about the different areas of physics, the different applications and implications that it can have on the world, I've gotten a lot more interested just in the broader field of physics and in the people that work in physics as well. So I'm now happy to be a physics student.
I worked in the audio industry in a recording studio prior to this, and I lived in LA working in a studio for a little bit. And I kind of got turned off of the industry and decided to pursue a career in astrophysics because space and stars have always been something that have been near and dear to me.
For me, I guess it was a little different since I went towards the physics education route. I was originally kind of inclined to do that because I had an interest in science and teaching. And so that's kind of how I chose ISU. And then ISU was also a nice means to do a bunch of other stuff as well. So I was able to start working with Dr. Kaplan and also working outside of the department with my minor and then art. And I could do all of these things in a realistic manner. So that was what really drew me to ISU specifically. And now moving forward, after especially doing work with Dr. Kaplan and then also across different disciplines, I'm looking to go to graduate school for things relating to science policy or public policy routes, specifically looking into the world of, nuclear studies, but also with the angle of my women and gender studies minor as well. So that's what I want to do. It's kind of broad, but I'm not quite sure what direct path that will go down.
So I took physics in high school, right? And I was totally into it because it was around that time that the movie Contact came out.
Whatever it is, it ain't local.
Position
I checked interferometry somewhere in Lyra, I think.
Vega?
Can't be. It's only 26 light years away.
I want all these people out of here.
Right. And so I'm like, oh, I obviously want to be Jodie Foster when I grow up and like go meet aliens in Pensacola and all that sort of thing.
Naturally.
And it did not occur to me until I started having this series of conversations how interconnected physics, space, nuclear war, and politics are intertwined. Did you know that more than I did? You know,
It's interesting you have kind of come to terms with that, because I had a similar kind of recognition of that fact when I first decided to return to school and go into astrophysics. I thought all of the research was just purely studying stars and expanding human knowledge and what else is out there and how things work out there. And then I learned that a lot of the time, it is a pathway for training scientists who will eventually work on nuclear weapons. The astrophysicist to nuclear weapon scientist pipeline is a very common one.
I wonder about that, like kind of the inevitability of astrophysics in engaging with this, and how Fred Lamb specifically said, you know, when I went into academia as an astrophysicist, my colleagues were some of the scientists that had worked on the Manhattan Project, right? That you have this knowledge, you have enough knowledge to be dangerous, and the government really wants what you have.
I mean, I think that's such a relevant point in physics, is the accountability of scientists, especially physicists, when it comes to, you know, always tying back to those who were either involved in the Manhattan Project or those who were, you know, scientists that helped create weapons of mass destruction. And it's something interesting that people like Dr. Kaplan and many scientists alike will say things that kind of shift the directive, where it's like, okay, we don't have to make the weapons, we can be the ones trying to stop the creation of that. And though one of the good things with our profession and our field is, though that might be the case in the outside perception of scientists, we can use that as a means to end these kinds of problems and take accountability and responsibility for lots of the destruction that's already happened, and hope that we can shift the narrative and not progress down that path just because it's already laid out for us.
I see it in a pretty similar way to you, maybe just a little bit different framing. So like Andy, I want to do astrophysics research as a career, but I just purely want to do that. I'm not really interested in working for the government for nuclear weapons or anything like that. But then at the same time, that does present the new problem of, I'm just doing astrophysics research. How really is that making a fundamental impact on the world? What kind of legacy will I have behind somebody who did research on interesting stars or something like that? I think that I kind of view the nuclear weapons issue as kind of a doorway to creating a broader impact, but maybe from the other side, as some famous astrophysicists have previously. So my impact will hopefully be astrophysics research, but hopefully will also be advocacy for reduction in nuclear weapons threats and using the knowledge that I have for good and harm reduction. Especially
in my research, like I mentioned, I do exotic stars, theoretical exotic stars. We don't even know if these things exist. So I like the idea of having something actually practical to kind of push toward and to work on. That being said, I kind of take pride in the fact that none of my research so far has any practical use whatsoever. But in reality, it does. And it gives us the experience and the knowledge to kind of speak on these sorts of things, I feel, and to be advocates for the safety of nuclear weapons use in the future.
It can become this narrative where people are saying, you know, if you're not using your field or your interest for good, then you're not like contributing value. But that doesn't mean that the work, you know, that people like you with your exact interest wouldn't be adding immense value to the field. And I think that alone is valuable in and of itself. Like, not everyone is going to be interested in everything always. I think it's more when you can do something, you know, you do it and you do it well, and that adds value. So it's not like every physicist has to either make the bombs or not make the bombs, you know.
Have you come across a physicist that is like pro-bomb? I mean, at some point, if the scientists working on the Manhattan Project were not on board. And there was a different messaging, right? This was really around, hey, it's World War II. This is our opportunity to save the world by bombing Japan. Maybe a false narrative for them, but at the end of the day, I think we can argue that those scientists were working under good and altruistic motivations. Now, knowing what we know, is it possible to be like a pro-nuclear weapons physicist? There have to be some, because you're working on testing, you're enriching uranium, you're doing all of these things.
I'm not sure if it's so much pro-nuclear bomb as much as it is pro giving me money. I think that's the key thing. The industry pays a lot, and it pays a lot more than certain research fields do. And so it's a question. I feel like it's more of a question of what's your price tag? I don't know. Have you guys thought about this at all? Have you had this a similar conversation as me?
I think lots of people, whether physicists, scientists, anyone alike, has this conversation with someone. And I think it also goes like one step backwards, where like all of us did physics, all of us do physics, but it's also like we are all also dimensional people outside of physics. And it's kind of going into, it's like, what did you know? What were you exposed to on knowledge about nuclear weapons and knowledge on the creation of nuclear weapons, and not just the physics of it, but I'm sure we've all interacted with people that are, very pro nuclear weapons or very pro, money with nuclear weapons. And I think it kind of comes back to a broader question for not just physicists, but for everyone. It's like, what do we actually know about this topic? What have we learned? What are we educating others on this topic? And it's all based on context, right? Like if you grew up and your parents say something, you'll probably believe that for a good while until maybe, you're exposed to different things. So I think as physicists, maybe, we have some specific interactions with, oh, do you want to make nuclear weapons? But it's also like outside of that, it's like for me, at least on the education side of it as well, or like having to take ed classes and stuff. It's also the side like, what do you teach your students, and what do your students know, and what are you allowed or not allowed to say?
I think there's also kind of a disconnect between the physicists who are contributing to the development of these nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapons themselves, because it's not always like you're physically assembling the nuclear weapon, you're detailing the exact schematics on how it would work. Sometimes it's just you're working on a very small problem that will have some kind of application to a weapon someday in the future. And even though you're technically being paid to develop nuclear weapons, there's very much a dissonance and a distance between this is what I'm working on, and this is the potential implications of my work.
There was a speaker, again, last term, who used the phrase, the allure of the machine. That really appealed to me. And like, I understood that phrase as soon as she said it. As physicists, we're interested in the science of it all. And so what better science to be interested in than this massive effort of hundreds of scientists all putting their heads together to create one thing. That clicked with me because I do find it all very fascinating, but I don't want to create things or work on things that will inevitably harm people.
Nobody's saying this is dangerous.
They're gonna build it.
Who gets to go, though?
It's complicated, Ellie.
Who gets to go?
By doing this, you're willing to risk your life. You're willing to give your life and die for this. Why?
Do you think that there's a way to change it from the inside, and maybe be working on these projects, but approach it from, say, a harm reduction perspective? Everyone that I've asked, like, can we do this more responsibly so there's less world annihilation involved? And they're like, basically, no, you just have to not do it. So I'm curious about if you've thought about any ways that because it's legitimate that you can be like, this is fascinating and it's advancing knowledge and we're learning things that we didn't know before, and that's important. But is there a way to approach it that maybe potentially that the advancement of these weapons is actually an effort to reduce the harm that they could cause? Like, can we have our bombs and eat them too, I guess is the question.
I mean, I think that's a incredibly important question, and one that many people probably are thinking, whether they say it or not. it's kind of a situation where it's like kind of hard to say yes or no. Can we do it or not? I'd like to believe that we can all use, our field, our platform, our voices to shift the narrative, whether that's towards threat reduction or anything else, any other topic. I think it just is kind of a situation where we have to work together. There's no world in which we're going to solve these things if we all stay isolated. Like even within physicist communities, they need to work with other physicists, and then across disciplines, I think is just at this point necessary in order to progress forward.
I think in this current environment and current perspective on nuclear weapons, somebody is going to be the one building or contributing to the nuclear weapons. There's not an event right now in the current climate where somebody is not going to be working on the nuclear weapons. That's just not realistic. But that does mean that you can have different kinds of people working on the nuclear weapons. So do you have somebody who is kind of in that cognitive dissonance, in that kind of blinders on their eyes, not really thinking about the implications of their work as they're working in these national labs, working to build these weapons, kind of not using their position as somebody who is contributing to nuclear weapons to say, hey, maybe we should reconsider how we view this work? Do you have somebody like that? Or do you have somebody who is kind of more mindful about the work that they're doing, kind of more mindful about its broader applications, and more mindful about their role in that? So knowing that they are the people who are contributing to these nuclear weapons, but also knowing that that gives them a unique position of power, a unique perspective to be able to say, hey, maybe we need to reconsider how we as a country, how we as a world view these things that we're building here.
Being mindful of what you're doing, I think, is the most important part.
I think it is very easy to leave ethics out of it when you're teaching physics, when you're learning physics, because, you're in the classroom, you're learning about this equation,
science.
this formula.
It's science. Yeah, of course, there's no ethics involved. Science is science.
Right. Yeah. It's just so easy to leave that aspect of it out of the picture. But there comes a time when that can't be ignored. And so it really is up to, have you had professors, have you had mentors who have cared enough, who have respected the implications enough to give you this kind of base ground idea of what your responsibility is as a physicist beyond just do science.
The general consensus is that especially Gen Z is facing these really, really big existential questions. Climate change, right? Being one. And I wonder, maybe this was more on your radar, more so than the average person because you are sciencey people. But I wonder if this sort of looming threat of nuclear war was something that you were aware of, or if it weighs on your consciousness at all in the same way that climate change or like women's rights or whatever the big question of the day is generationally. I wonder if you're like, oh yeah, and by the way, we all might die from nuclear war, so that's cool. And how you kind of approach life in the world, knowing that is something that's out there and looming.
I think consciously in the past, now I would give a completely different answer for my present self, but in the past, consciously, nuclear weapons were not really a looming threat on my mind, but they certainly were subconsciously. I've had recurring nightmares for years where I just wake up because I've had a dream where the Midwest is getting bombed for some reason. And I wake up in the middle of the night and I frantically Google fallout maps to see what kind of radioactive fallout we in Bloomington Normal would face. And I'm not entirely sure why that's been plaguing my subconscious mind since I was like 11, but it's been a very common recurring theme for me for some reason. So I think that somehow there was a part of me that knew that this was an issue that was not just left in the era of the Cold War, not just left in the 60s, but was still very prevalent now. And while maybe before learning a lot more about the imminent threat of nuclear war, I was kind of more focused on like, yeah, the climate's kind of a disaster right now. We should do something about that. I still kind of recognized that this was maybe something to be concerned about.
The thing about climate change is the like helpful, hopeless nature of it, that you feel like, and this actually stems back to the 80s, where I was like, if I just recycle my plastic water bottle, then I will save the earth. There was more of a sense that one individual person could do something to solve for climate change. As we've gotten further along, we realize that this is systemic, right? And so I kind of wonder, kind of throwing into the mix, where you feel like your own personal agency lies or doesn't in the problem of nuclear weapons.
I think that's been a key thing for myself as well, is that any one person can't do anything about it. It's the whole that needs to do something about it. We have to band together, and then we can see real change. Because like you mentioned, it is systemic. Therefore, we need to, as a system, solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think exactly. I mean, like these past two questions, I think are deeply important for everyone to kind of assess their position in this, is because we have to work together. And so I think in terms of like our own personal agency, I think sometimes it can be easier to just turn a blind eye because maybe it helps you sleep at night. But I think ultimately working together, if everyone carries a little weight, it'll make it a lot easier. Being Japanese American, I think it was a very different narrative that I had coming into this kind of area of study, just because it was a thing that everyone knew about, but no one kind of talked about deeply within kind of the communities I grew up in. But everyone knew how important and how devastating nuclear weapons can be and are. And so I think for me, that was just always kind of embedded within my thinking process. And I think it's all based on context, right? Like the way I grew up is very different from the way like anybody else I meet grows up. But I think that also makes it very specific to how we can contribute to this work, where all of us have some sort of story that brought us in here, just the same as anybody you talk to about these issues has some sort of interesting story to tell you about what really got them interested into this topic. Whatever that reason might be, using that and utilizing that to then listen to other people's stories and listen to what other people have to offer, and then working together. You know, like Andy said, we can't do this alone. We can't isolate and hope that the world is not going to explode.
I'm gonna explode. You mean you're gonna explode? I'm gonna explode. Watch out. I'm gonna explode like atomic bomb.
Is this your first presidential election, Claire? Oh my gosh, bless. I would say it's not always like this, but it kind of is lately. Everyone that I've spoken to has said the threat has either never been this high or it has not been this high since like the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the threat of nuclear war. It is an existential crisis of immediate concern, and yet it does not appear on any political platform or in any discussions around the presidential election, Senate races. To me, it hasn't bubbled to the surface in political discourse other than a couple of kind of flippant comments here and there about how nuclear is bad. So what are you hearing and seeing and feeling, and how you're viewing this as something that you might vote on?
I think there kind of maybe is something that's said there in the silence of politicians, because a lot of the nuclear issue is an issue of perception. It's how are we presenting ourselves to the other people who have nuclear weapons, because we have nuclear weapons because other people have nuclear weapons, and they have nuclear weapons because we have nuclear weapons. So I wonder if there is something to that kind of silence on the issue, maybe saying like, if I ignore this long enough, maybe it will just disappear and go away.
It's an issue that should be brought up more, because it's not, like Claire said, it's not going to go away. We can't just sit there and ignore it, because it is a greater threat than ever. I mean, I don't know if you guys knew this or not, but a couple years ago, we were an inch away from nuclear war because Russia essentially planted a dirty bomb and said that Ukraine was about to use nuclear weapons. And they were going to use that as an excuse to use their nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Luckily, they were kind of called out, and it was luckily prevented, but we were extremely close because they planned this out. They planned this sort of conspiracy as an excuse to use their weapons against Ukraine.
Kind of like what both of you said, it comes back to, you know, we don't see it a lot in the news. We don't see a lot with politicians and such. And I think that's the exact push that maybe we need to see that people do need to talk about it, and that we as young people and the younger generation need to see that and think, oh, I shouldn't do that just because they're doing that. We can talk about this, we can do this and vote. We can use what we can do as people individually and vote and encourage other people to vote. You can't necessarily tell people what to vote for, but at least people should exercise that right to vote. Like what Andy said, like this kind of thing with, we were so close to, nuclear war, and people still think that the first and only bombs used were for Japan, and that's just not true. I think it all kind of comes back to, what do we know about this? And being ignorant is doing more harm. At least one thing you can do, as simple as it seems, is vote.
I don't know if either of you were able to vote in the 2016 election, but I think I bring a unique perspective there because I was in college at that time and I'm in college again at this time. It was so interesting back then to hear certain people and certain students talk about how they weren't going to vote because they either A, felt like they had no impact, or B, didn't like any officials and everything's bad, so I'm just going to not vote at all. Throwing away your vote is one of the worst things you can do, I think. I think it is essential as a U.S. citizen to exercise your rights as a U.S. citizen and go out and vote. And that's the most important thing individually. Going back to that conversation, what we can do individually is to vote. I think that mindset of not voting and abstaining from voting has kind of waned somewhat because it is such a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A chaotic climate, I suppose.
Do you think that that's changed since Joe Biden dropped out of the race? I feel like there was a bit of that sort of apathy that you're talking about, Andy, when Trump and Biden were the candidates, and people are like, well, I don't like either one of them, so I'll just stay home. Do you find that there's a difference between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, for example?
I have actually still seen a lot of this voter apathy among people my age. And I was not voting during the 2016 presidential election, so I can't really compare it to what my experience is.
Yeah,
with
maybe
others.
that's more my audience. The people that I knew who didn't vote then are now like, oh, I need to vote.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe there was a lesson to be learned there.
Yeah.
If you didn't maybe vote in the 2016 presidential election, and if you weren't happy with the outcomes of that election, then it can kind of be a wake-up call saying, wow, maybe I could have done something to effect change towards something that is more preferable to me. But I think that a lot of people in my generation, for whom this is the first presidential election they can vote in, they kind of haven't had that wake-up call yet. They kind of are still seeing this issue as something they're being forced to choose between maybe two candidates, neither of whom appeal to them. And I think that they kind of feel like their best move there is to just not vote. The best thing that you can do in this opportunity, in this election, is to just make it go the way that you would least hate. If you're not a fan of either candidate, you can still do something, and that is choose somebody that it won't make your blood boil to see at the inauguration in January.
I think for undergrads, right? I think one of the major sticking points with Kamala Harris is her stance on Israel. And so that applies directly to, the things that Dr. Lamb was talking about yesterday in terms of our unapologetic, uncompromising support of Israel. And there are many young Gen Z folks who are very pro-Palestinian, right? And feel like that a vote for Kamala Harris would be a vote for quote unquote genocide. But in thinking about the Iran deal and the just bubbling situation in the Middle East being not quite so clear cut as Israel and Hamas in Gaza, I wonder if, understanding the larger picture of that, if you would challenge that view of Kamala Harris being kind of unilateral on that issue.
As people of a young generation, I think we all see that narrative. And I think ultimately it's like what Claire said. No one candidate, no one person for that matter is going to align with all of your beliefs. Whatever your viewpoints are, pick someone that most aligns with that. And if you choose that person, maybe they're not perfect. Neither of them are perfect. They're people. But ultimately it's like, not to be a pessimist, but you have to choose the lesser of two evils, right? Like we can't just not vote for one person because they have certain flaws, and that's true. That doesn't mean don't acknowledge them. That doesn't mean don't advocate for, productive change, but it also isn't an excuse to then be like, well, I'm just not going to vote then, because then you're just advocating for a different route to happen.
So do you think Chapel Roan should have endorsed somebody?
I think Chapel Roan has every right to abstain from any statements as an artist. She has her own personal life.
Touche.
I think it is really important that people consciously avoid being a single issue voter, and that you look at the bigger picture. If one issue is swaying you from voting for somebody, maybe rethink priorities, look at the alternative outcomes, and weigh those options. The world doesn't need to be black and white. In fact, the world is entirely gray. Like Naomi said, there's not going to be any one person that exactly aligns with your views. Your views are unique to you. There's not one person in the world, let alone a politician, that's going to align with you perfectly.
I am also curious to get your perspectives on another sort of really unique thing in this race, and that's kind of the mainline Republican Party not really endorsing Donald Trump, and that includes a lot of military folks who are involved in national security and military defense. Does that give you pause, or does that just feel like it kind of swims in the soup for you?
I think a lot of that issue of a lot of the Republican Party, a lot of people who have traditionally been Republican, not supporting Donald Trump, may come down less to an issue of policy, although I'm sure that does have something to do with it, and more to an issue of personality. As was discussed on the first episode of this podcast, Donald Trump is not known to be the most level-headed person. And that is certainly applicable when we're thinking about the fact that as president, he would have sole authority to authorize nuclear bomb use. But it also comes down to a lot of other things. And, part of nuclear weapons is relations with other countries. What kind of relations with other countries are you going to have with somebody who is very erratic, very hot-headed, things like that? And I think that maybe even though many outspoken Republicans, many people who are prominent in the Republican Party might agree with a lot of the things that Donald Trump is proposing as his policies, they might see a certain danger in the way that he presents himself, in the way that he deals with other nations, in the way that he would react in the event of a nuclear scenario or in the event of a threat of a nuclear scenario.
It's been very interesting, to say the least, and I'm sure it impacts people older than myself even more, who have been through more elections. This is my third, and even still seeing Republicans not only not endorse their leading candidate, but endorse the opposing candidate. Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris, which is wild. That is unheard of, even to me, who has only seen a couple of elections. To somebody who has been voting for 20, 30 years, that is even more astounding. That doesn't happen.
It's significant, right? It feels like that matters for, and I don't know exactly why it matters, but it feels like because it is so different. It
feels important. Yeah. And it feels, I don't know, it feels different.
Yeah. And maybe it also signals just a cultural shift in that party, that
certainly
they've been running in parallel roads, and maybe now there's a fork.
Mm-hmm.
Liz Cheney has talked about on multiple occasions the possibility of a different party, right? Of a third party. And maybe that in the future gives people more choices. Who knows? Right?
Maybe.
I mean, maybe this is a sign that it's going in the right direction, that people are starting to question things from the inside, whether that's through their political affiliation or not. And maybe if it goes down this direction for a little longer, maybe that's a good thing. As long as people are consciously making choices and not just being, kind of a hive mind and following what everyone else is doing.
It's been an incredible lineup of speakers, and I wonder what your kind of key takeaways have been so far, what you're thinking about as a result of this, what you're maybe thinking about differently, so what are your kind of big big tent, as Matt would say, your big tent ideas coming out of this series so far?
I think certainly a big idea for me has been pulling this out of maybe an isolated issue from the Cold War, maybe an isolated issue even from the bombing of Japan in World War II, and into something that is very much still present and is in fact continuing to affect people's lives, Americans' lives, in terrible ways. I think that it's been really important for myself, for the other attendees of the lecture series, for listeners of this podcast, to realize that we are kind of at a critical moment for nuclear weapons. Like, this is an issue that has been steadily escalating. We are at a great threat of nuclear war. A couple years ago in 2022, as Andy recounted, we were the closest to nuclear war that we've been in living memory. And I think that that's kind of something that a lot of people don't realize, just how present of an issue this is. And I really hope that by participating in this lecture series, by having this podcast out there, people do kind of realize that this is something that we need to be thinking about. This is something that we need to be affecting change in right now.
"12,000 Bombs" is a partnership between WGLT and Matt Kaplan. The 12,000 Bombs speaker series is presented with support from Illinois State University's Office of Research and Graduate Studies. I'm Lauren Warnicki. Production and operating support come from Rosalie Truback and Ryan Denham. Thank you to Claire Campbell, Andy Santarelli, and Naomi Sato for being our guests on this episode and for giving us all a little hope for the future. WGLT is Bloomington Normal's public media, part of the NPR network.